Yeah, sometimes if you try to, let's say, do an unfold, or in this case, I think the unfold is going to work okay. This mesh doesn't have a ton of errors, but if it tells you there's non-manifold mesh, well, what a non-manifold mesh is, let me just grab a plane to show you this. This is probably the simplest way to show it. And I'm going to go in and just make this thing a very simple mesh. Say a 2 by 2. So non-manifold mesh, and this happens sometimes through glitches, through user error, but let's say you have an edge extruded down, that's non-manifold. Technically speaking, the way polys should work is that every edge should be connecting to 2 polygon faces, right? So we have the 3 basic components of mesh, and in some cases, somehow this can happen where maybe you've done an extrusion, or you've scaled things in a weird way, and then the software gets confused and it sees 3 faces that are non-manifold, right? So we've got a 3rd polygon sitting somewhere connected to an edge. So sometimes you have to delete that, but let me show you Maya's mesh cleanup tool. So you can go mesh cleanup. I'm going to reset this so you can see my preferred settings here. So I'm going to go reset. Now, one thing I've seen people do, they just turn on things randomly, and I've gone over this a couple times, but what you want to do is turn on these options at the bottom. So the ones I use for kind of fixing really buggy stuff are the bottom sets of options. So the first one is lamina faces. So that means faces sharing all edges. So you can literally have, I don't know how it happens, but sometimes through weird collapses or illegal maneuvers, basically a polygon where like 2 or 3 or all of its edges are in the same sort of space. Then there's non-manifold geometry, which is what I just showed. There's edges with 0 length, so you can actually have edges that are basically infinitely small almost. Faces with 0 geometry, so where the edges are stacked and the vertices are stacked one on top of the other. Usually I don't turn on this option. This is faces with 0 map area. What that means is that sometimes when you do extrusions and you cut stuff, those polygons may not have UVs yet. So if you turn that option on, it'll literally just like eat through the mesh and collapse it down to like nothing. So that one I find very destructive if you're trying to just get to a place where you can UV. And then invalid components is literally just bugs in the mesh. Sometimes this used to happen a lot more, I think like 5-6 years ago. You would see literally a vertice shooting off in space. Like it looked like it was firing off like 1,000 miles away, and it created this spike on the model. So that oftentimes is a sign that there's some weird mathematical glitch happening in the file or in the software. So when you do a cleanup, it should in fact remove it. For some reason it doesn't technically remove manifold mesh always, or it doesn't always clean up this stuff. And if you go back to cleanup, I'll show you what happens. Let's say I reset this just so you guys can see. Let's say you turn on 4-sided and hit apply. It will literally say, I don't want to allow 4-sided faces. So some people I've seen say, oh, all my mesh went triangular when I did a cleanup. Well, it's because you turn that option on. If you have faces with more than 4 sides, what it's basically saying is that if there are polys, so I'll jump back to the other file. If there are polygons with more than 4 sides, it'll automatically triangulate them. So we'll put triangles in for you, but sometimes that can, again, mess up the surface or the mesh. Concave mesh or concave faces are basically polygons that are kind of caving in a bit in a way. So something, let's say like this, where maybe the face is like kind of bent, so it's concave, right? It's almost taking on a little bit of a bowl shape, So that's a concave face. So if I select this object, hit apply, maybe it'll fix it, maybe not. Faces with holes, it'll try to fix, or non-planar faces. So actually, let me lift that one back up. This is also sort of similar. So a non-planar face, you see it'll actually split across here in a triangular fashion. Sometimes I do want non-planar faces. There are a lot of times where I kind of cheat the software a bit, and so I often don't use these particular options. Maybe I'll use faces with no more than 4 sides. So if you're going to turn on these options, this would probably be the most I would do, and in many cases I would actually not even use those faces with more than 4 sides, because I want to fix it by hand and do maybe a cleaner job than what Maya would do automatically, right? If you let the software think for you, you're going to seem pretty dumb, because the software is still pretty dumb despite all its great features, okay? So I'll go back to this other piece of mesh here to show you this, right? So if I went into, oops, let's switch over to modeling, not animation. Go to mesh, cleanup. By the way, if you want to try to establish these as a default, you know, so I like these as a default down here, so I'm going to go to File, Save Settings. I'm going to turn on this option though and hit cleanup. So it's going to take a second. It'll run through the mesh, and you will see it will triangulate those polygons, like I said, that are more than 4 sides, right? Now, there is another issue, and I've talked about normals in the past. So the normals of the object themselves matter. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's go back to this here. So this, for example, right? You see that this is actually kind of a low poly object. It's actually a fairly low poly object, but there is some sort of smooth shading happening across here. So if your mesh, let me just set the whole object to hard edge and make sure that the normals are unlocked so we can see that. There we go. So you see, you're seeing every single polygon, right? There's no kind of smoothing cheat to the surface, right? You do want to take care of this issue first, both on the high res and the low res. So if you see any weird shading or maybe like segments where you don't want segments to appear, what I often will do is go to Mesh Display, Soften Harden Edges. Because some areas we want to be soft, some areas we want to be hard. And if you click on Soften Edge everywhere, you see you get this kind of shading. So I'm sure some of you have seen areas of your mesh that kind of look like this, where the shadows are smearing across an edge in a weird way. And what's actually happening is that the model is actually trying to smooth or fake smooth across a hard edge where there's such an extreme change, and it shouldn't be doing that. So, you know, in the past I would have to do something like this where it's like these polygons here and say, you know what, I want just this area to be smooth. So I'd go Soften Edge. Or maybe this area I'd say, you know, I want to harden this edge, and you see the shading improves, and I want to harden the edges connected to this piece over here as well. So I'd go to Mesh Display, Harden Edge. And so we get smooth shading right across this band, but then hard shading across that edge where there's an extreme change in angle. Now, it's a nightmare to do across a whole piece like this, so my simple fix for that is to simply go Soften Harden Edges. So what it says is anything within 30 degrees, so any polygon that bends at the edge point, less than or up to 30 degrees will get smoothing. Anything over that will be hard surface look. Will have a hard edge. So I'll hit apply. Oftentimes that default works amazingly well, right? So it gives you hard creases where you need it, and it gives you smoothing where you need it as well. So that's a really, really important thing, because that's the object's normals. Those normals will also be translated into the normal map itself. So if you see any weird shading in either the high or the low res mesh, you have to fix it. So as I was saying, yeah, you want to kind of go through and check for any possible, you know, glitches. This thing, you know, for the most part looks fine. So one thing you do want to do when working with a high res and a low res mesh for baking normals is, you know, you have to decide what areas are going to have detail that I need to reproduce in the low res. So for example, a lot of stuff can be baked out, right? If it's really flat and really small sort of details, like these little creases, these little kind of cut-ins, this plate, these little screws here, right? These things are very, very shallow detail. They don't necessarily need to be reproduced on the low res. So if I take a look at the low res version, it's got maybe the plate here, but it doesn't have the bolts, because those bolts will be captured as a normal map detail, right? But the larger elements that actually impact on the silhouette. So this is what I mentioned earlier. The stuff that's in the silhouette, like these dials that protrude quite a bit, the lenses, maybe this faceplate, that sort of stuff will need to be there. So the two silhouettes have to be fairly close to each other. Okay, so that's important. The other thing I also highly recommend is that you start to kind of work on your pivot points and your scale and your object's location. So in this case, I think this object is frozen. What I often like to do is match the pivot points, match the object location. The reason is that Xnormal. So Xnormal is a separate software, right? So I've got Xnormal here. I think I've got a couple of other mesh that I could show you examples of how the baking works, but basically you go into a high-res mesh, you load a high-res object, go to your low-res mesh, you load your low-res object, which is going to be an OBJ. And we have a little tool here, and essentially what the software needs to do is calculate the distance between the high-res and the low-res surfaces to get a better, more accurate normal map. So what it will literally do is kind of do almost like a lighting calculation where it compares the distance between the two surfaces. So let's say you had a sphere, and then you had a sphere with a couple of extrusions. It would analyze that surface and then kind of bounce back and forth between the two and give you this sort of measurement between the two surfaces, and then you could generate a normal map. So let's say I'm going to just use my face as an example that I had from yesterday. So what that tool does is, let's go to ray distance. I'll click on go. It's going to start to calculate. And again, this mesh has to be clean. Like I said, no 5-sided polys or above. Everything has to be 3 or 4-sided. Otherwise, this calculation will not start. So if you're in Xnormal and you're seeing the calculation just sitting there and it doesn't show you it's computing, it doesn't show these distances, your numbers may be different, but if it doesn't show Fmin, Fmax, Rmin, Rmax, then typically that's a sign that one or both of the meshes needs to be cleaned up. So I'm going to hit stop on that. Usually I let it run for between 30 and 60 seconds, and then you copy the results. What it will do is copy those results into the low-res mesh, and so you'll get this sort of numerical value copied over here. When you go to bake, I'm just using 2K as my sort of test. I usually will switch to 4K for the final, but for the speed of the demo, I just want to show you this result. So if you hit generate, it's actually going to look at the UVs of the low res and then capture, in this case there's high res sculpting detail. So you'll see it generate out all this kind of detail in the normal map. Okay? Yes. Yeah, one 5-sided poly alone will stop this in its tracks. Also, if you have bad UVs, you'll see maybe some weird collisions. So I think in this case there may be some weird UVs here. You see there's little glitchy spots here. Might be hard to see, but there's a couple little glitchy zones in here. This could be bad UVs, or it could be that there's a deep crevice, and so it's kind of picking up two different surfaces at the same time. So sometimes that's a minor issue, but half the time, you know, if it's tiny little spots, I'll just literally Photoshop it with a heel brush. So anyways, I want to get back to this. I'm going to undo this automatic. Let's go back here. Can I get back? Pre-cleanup. Or maybe I'll just reopen this file. Nope, there we go. Okay, so as I was saying, I want to get back to this sort of pivot issue. Now in this case, this object has a nice kind of roughly central point that I can use as a reference. So I can hit D and then maybe hold V and drop this pivot point right down to this area here. And then I'll hit D to turn this off. Now the pivot point, as you notice, hasn't changed. It technically looks like it's at the dead center of the world, which it is not. So you may have to go into Modify and Bake Pivot, or yeah, for some reason this is kind of slow in this recent update of Maya. Slow and buggy. So I'm gonna give it a minute and hopefully it'll, there we go. So once it bakes the pivot, it actually will show you the object's true location in space. So I want this to be at the 0. You know, this is usually a good method or technique for keeping yourself kind of in a nice central position in the world. So sometimes, as you guys may have noticed as well, Maya's mirroring tools or symmetry tools don't work. And in this way, if your object is nicely centered and centered in the world, you can do world XYZ symmetry. So that's another sort of tip. So I'm going to save this, and I'm going to close this. So the way I typically deal with these objects is you can build them as separate mesh pieces, have them kind of floating on top of each other. But for the final production, you will have to combine pretty much the entire high poly object, and then as a separate object. So in this case, I've got the low poly. It's all combined as one object. I'm going to delete the history, delete any groups that may be left behind. And then I'm going to rename this. This is Yashica was the name of the camera. Yashica LP. So I'm going to call this Yashica LP for low poly. And if you want, you can put a space in there as well. So now I can do a file. I can do an import, I guess. Imports. And then I've got assignment 2 here. Import. So there's the import. Let me turn on the grid so we can see what's going on. So you see the high poly's in a nice location. It's centered. This one, yeah, unfortunately I don't have the exact same reference point for that camera to be centered. So sometimes what I'll do is do kind of what I did earlier with the face there. I can do a little extrusion, offset the face, and then if I merge it to center, that actually now makes it, right, a proper piece of mesh. It's not just this multi-sided face. And now when I hit D, sorry, I'll hit W for the move tool, hit D to make the pivot live, and then hold V to snap that to that point there. Okay, so hit D again to turn that off. And if we go to modify, bake pivot, again we can see it's true offset in the world now. So if I hit 0, 0, for all the axes, it should for the most part be lined up the same. Now, as you can see, this is not exact, right? So I may need to do a little bit of fudging or nudging of this thing just to make sure the two are overlapping. So this, this is a bit of a minor issue. The shapes are not quite lining up, so I may have to eyeball this a bit just to get it as close as possible. And as you notice, the pivot is going to be shifted off again from the world, right? So again, I'm just going to try to get as close as I can with this. There, I think that's pretty good for the most part. So let me hit D again. I'm going to turn on, in this case, well, I can hold X actually. X will snap to the grid, and then I'll snap to the dead center of the grid. And then I'll hit D again to turn off that live pivot option. Again, I'll need to go to modify, bake pivot. So again, it's the pivot of the two objects. If I click on either one, right, the high poly, the low poly, right, these things are in exactly the same, and according to their pivots, they're both at the 0 point of the world, right? Okay, so I'll hit Control 1 to isolate this object. For some reason Control 1 is not working, so I'll just hit H instead to hide the high poly. So as I was saying before, right, we can't leave any face with more than 4 sides. So I can try the mesh cleanup. I might try it and just to see how it works. So let's say faces with more than 4 sides. Right, it works okay. It doesn't appear as though there's any kind of weird glitchiness in the model. By the way, I strongly recommend this when modeling in your attribute editor. So let me undo this. Like I said, my preference is not to let the software do it. I typically want to do it by hand. But when it comes to previewing your models, I typically like to use a blend material set to kind of a darker gray. And then I will usually increase my speck color and speck roll off. So what that allows you to do is as you rotate across the surface, right, you can sort of see the shininess. It's actually kind of a way to give you feedback. So if you ever see any glitches in the normals, you'll really see them very quickly, either mesh glitches or normals glitches here. Okay, so as I said before, that auto triangulation is is okay, but it's not necessarily ideal. So extrusions are one quick way to kind of clean up some of this stuff. So I'll do an extrusion and then merge that to the center. I have a feeling this face as well, right? Because of these bevels back here. Again, I need to do the extrusion first with an offset before I collapse or merge to center. There we go. So I'm going to try to do this quickly. There. The other thing I should show you guys too, let's say I take a look at this lens piece. you know, if this was a sphere and squashed flat, you may want to delete the mesh that you're never going to see, right? Because this actually takes up valuable UV space. So if there's like a cap on the back of that cylinder, it should be deleted and open, right? Because you're never going to see those polys. They're never going to be pulled apart. I mean, unless that's part of your plan animation-wise, right? So even sometimes stuff like this, I think this actually, is this a thickness or... Oh no, this is part of the dial, so that's actually okay. So it looks like in this case, this mesh was cleaned up in a good way. In this case, if you take a look at this piece of mesh, there is a back plate, but it's needed because we can see part of that mesh from the back, right? But let's take a look at this part. So maybe, you know, depending, I may be able to delete these faces here. So I'll keep them selected and see if I can kind of view them, right? I don't think I can, so there may be a case to sort of delete those, but I think there's enough of a gap that I can, so I'll leave those alone. Okay. Like I said, this sort of method of putting in at least triangles is not bad. The extrude and then merge to center, it's okay. I personally don't like it. I usually like to put connecting edges, but I know you guys have a ton of other work, so desperate times call for desperate measures, as they say. Yeah. Well, that's a good question. So how do you make sure that the low and the high poly matches? Well, have them both in the same scene. If you're building with Maya, if you built your high poly with Maya, you plan to build your low res with Maya, just one thing I do, so I mentioned this before, if you built your low res, so a lot of times when I start building, I actually build to this level, and then, right, I will, you build to this level, save a version. So hopefully you have an early version that's actually already kind of your low poly, right? So when you do good blocking, you don't have to worry too much about doing a lot of extra modeling for the low res. It may already be done. If you haven't, or if you lost the files, right, well then you have to just eyeball it, right? You know, for this dial, you'd make a new cylinder, do an extrusion, so you'd be kind of rebuilding it while looking at the high poly at the same time, okay? So you'd have to kind of go piece by piece and rebuild it in a simplified fashion, basically. Does that make sense? Yes, I mean you could. So it's recorded, yeah. So the same could sort of be said maybe of some of this stuff. You know, sometimes I'll take the higher poly mesh if I don't have the lower poly and just start removing edges. So if I had a clone of this, I would say, oh, maybe I'll take out every second or third edge. Shift double click, control backspace, right? And that gets you a low poly version pretty quickly. Usually I do every second edge, right? So if I'm simplifying for low res, I haven't made a copy, but I would typically select my object and then do Control D, move the copy over. But if you're just trying to chop this thing down, I've seen a lot of people do this, and it's frightening if you're doing this still. If you hit backspace, it takes out the edges, but it leaves the vertices behind, which is a nightmare. It breaks your selection ability. So if I double click, the selection dies where those vertices are just hanging out. So you have to, let me go back, always control backspace, because I wish this was a default. Whether you hit backspace or delete, that on its own should allow you to delete the edges and the vertices that are connected to them, right, where there's an intersecting edge, but it's not. So you have to hold control and then hit backspace. So hold control, hit backspace, and it takes out the edge and any vertices that may be affiliated with that edge. So sometimes when you're selecting stuff, let's say if you're in the move tool or the rotate tool, right, it's kind of hard to like double click another edge because the gizmo may obscure it. So I just simply hit Q, which is actually just simply selecting. It's because actually, you know, what Q does is actually says select and move. So you can select with it and move, or select and rotate, select and scale. But Q is simply just select. So you don't have that interference of the gizmo. Again, it's one of those like little things that you're like, oh, how do I select, you know, if I was trying to reduce this lettering or something, right? If I had the move tool there, it could start to get in the way, right? Especially if I'm trying to go up here, it's going to try to tell me, oh, you want to extrude instead of just adding to the selection. So it can be weird that way, right? So it's often just easier to hit Q and then just do your double click select.